After decades of hostilities, Cuba and the United States seem to be turning a corner in relations after former President Barack Obama restored ties between the two countries amid hopes of increased travel and trade.
22 intergovernmental agreements were signed in just 2 years, which is significant.
As part of the détente, Washington and Havana inked various agreements, including cooperation in law enforcement and information sharing, noticeably in the battle against drugs, human trafficking, cybersecurity, and marine life conservation. But some of that may now be in jeopardy.
There have been some very limited agreements on economic issues. For example, the United States allows telecommunication companies to have agreements with Cuban telecommunication companies.
President Trump is expected to announce tighter restrictions with Cuba on Friday. One study by the coalition Engage Cuba believes it could cost the U.S. as much as $6.5 billion and cut nearly 12,000 jobs over the next few years. One former Cuban diplomat says that while the economic embargo against Cuba was never lifted during the Obama administration, there has been progress.
I think with Trump there will be certainly stagnation, maybe reversal, and the best one can hope for is a slower pace.
The most visible change on the island is perhaps the surge of U.S. visitors coming in on cruise ships and planes. Between January and May in 2017, Cuban officials report an increase of 145% of U.S. visitors to the island compared to the same period last year. Keiko, an accountant from the United States, fears the cultural exchanges like the one she took part in will no longer be possible if Trump reverses course.
I was really happy for both, us Americans and Cubans that when Obama changed, it was really, really happy. So of course, no, I'm not very happy about it at all, no.
In one recent poll, 64% of U.S. Republican voters supported easing travel restrictions and trade with Cuba. But with a change in policy on its way, many are wondering whether the two countries are headed in the wrong direction. Michelle Begue, CGTN, La Habana.
Right, let's get you more on this story now. Michelle Begue, whose report you just heard there, now joins me live from Havana, Cuba. Michelle, looking at the impact, how will these new orders affect Cubans?
Well, what we're hearing before Trump's speech from the administration is that there might be more restrictions on how U.S. citizens who come here, who are visiting, spend their money. The idea is that they don't want any U.S. citizens giving money to the Cuban military. Now that's very difficult here because a lot of the companies here are state-run, and even the private companies, the ones owned by small businesses owned by Cuban people, their supplies come from state-run companies. So it's very hard not to have that trickle to, at some point, the Cuban government. But what we do know is that with the opening of relations between the two countries, there has been a surge of visitors. I said it earlier in this story. Right now, the Cuban officials say that during the first 5 months of this year, they've seen the amount of visitors that they had in a whole year just last year. That's a lot of people. You speak to Cubans on the street who are in the tourism industry, many of them say that they have seen many more U.S. citizens on the island, and that hopefully that money that comes in with tourism gets to the Cuban people who are in that industry. And if there's any type of restriction from the Trump administration on how U.S. citizens can spend their money here, if that begins to deter tourists or visitors who want to come to Cuba, then Cubans, you could say, would see an impact negatively in their income, especially those who work in the tourism sector. But we're going to have to see exactly what those details are during Trump's speech.
Now, Michelle, of course, the president hasn't made his announcement yet. He is still on his way to Florida. But looking ahead, what exactly can we expect from the Cuban government in response to these expected restrictions?
Well, the Trump administration says that they're trying to push the Cuban government. We're going to have to see what their reaction is exactly. What we do know officially is that Bruno Rodriguez, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, is right now going to begin a tour through Europe and Turkey, in Italy, and in Austria. On Monday, he is set to speak. We've already received notification that Monday he will be speaking from Austria on international affairs. We don't know exactly what that will be, but we can assume that maybe once we hear from Trump that we could possibly get a response from the Cuban government officially on Monday. So we'll be trying to cover that as it comes.
All right, Michelle, thank you very much for those updates. Michelle Begue is speaking to us live there from Havana, Cuba.